In the bustling White House, where power and politics usually take center stage, it was a small voice that commanded the most attention that day. The hallways that had witnessed centuries of history were about to become the backdrop for a moment of unexpected vulnerability between two of the most talked about figures in America. "Mr. President, Elon Musk and his son are here to see you," announced the aide, standing at the Oval Office doorway. Donald Trump looked up from his desk, his expression brightening as he set aside the stack of papers he'd been reviewing. The meeting had been on his calendar for weeks, a discussion about space exploration and the potential for public-private partnerships that could reshape America's future among the stars. But what transpired that afternoon would venture far beyond rocket launches and satellite deployments. As the door opened, Elon Musk entered with his young son by his side. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the grandeur of the Oval Office, his gaze darting from the presidential seal on the carpet to the historic desk where so many world-altering decisions had been made. There was an innocence to his wonder, untainted by the political divisions that defined the adult world. "Welcome, welcome," Trump said, his voice carrying that distinctive tone of authority mixed with enthusiasm as he crossed the room to greet them. "And who do we have here? You must be the young genius I've heard so much about." The boy smiled shyly, standing a little straighter at the president's acknowledgement. There was something refreshingly genuine about children in rooms typically dominated by calculated politics and careful rhetoric. They hadn't yet learned to measure their words or hide their thoughts behind diplomatic phrasing. What nobody in that room could have anticipated was how a child's perspective would cut through the armor of one of the most powerful men in the world. The meeting began formally enough. Discussions of budget allocations, regulatory frameworks, and technological innovations filled the air. Maps of proposed launch sites were unfurled across the presidential desk. The adults spoke in the language of logistics and strategy, of timelines and benchmarks. But as the conversation progressed, the president noticed the boy growing quieter, his earlier excitement dimming. There was something contemplative in his young eyes, something that seemed to look beyond the room and the immediate conversation. "You've been pretty quiet over there," Trump said, turning his attention fully to the child. "What's on your mind, young man? What do you think about all this space talk?" It was a simple question, the kind adults often ask children without expecting particularly profound answers. Perhaps he anticipated enthusiastic talk of rockets or aliens, or the kinds of fantastical things that typically captivate young imaginations. Instead, what came next would catch everyone off guard. "Sir?" The boy began hesitantly, looking first at his father, then back to the president. "I was just thinking, why are we spending so much money going to space when there are still poor people on Earth?" The room fell silent. The straightforward question hung in the air, unembellished by political calculation or social niceties. It was the kind of question that only makes it into such rarefied spaces when delivered by those too young to understand the complexities of why such simple moral mathematics often goes unanswered. Trump's expression changed. The familiar confidence that had defined his public persona throughout his career flickered momentarily. In its place was something rarely seen, a flash of unguarded reflection. That's a good question," he said, his voice softer than usual. Musk shifted slightly in his chair, perhaps preparing to guide the conversation back to more familiar territory, but Trump raised his hand slightly, signaling that he wanted to hear more. "What else are you thinking?" he asked the boy. Encouraged by the president's interest, the child continued, his words flowing more freely now. "My dad shows me pictures of our rockets going to space, and they're really cool. But then sometimes when we drive around, I see people who don't have homes. I asked my dad why, and he said it's complicated." The boy looked down at his shoes for a moment, then back up, meeting the president's gaze with the unfiltered directness that only children can manage. "I told my dad that when I grow up, I want to end world hunger. I wish there weren't any poor people in the world. Everyone should have food and a house and be able to go to school." It wasn't just what the boy said, but how he said it, with complete conviction in the simple rightness of his vision, untainted by cynicism about human nature or the complexities of global economics. It was a pure distillation of hope. Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the child's face. Those in the room who knew the president well could see something shifting behind his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, of innocence, long since lost in the rough and tumble world of business and politics. "You know," Trump said finally, his voice uncharacteristically thoughtful, "I've spent my whole life building things, big, beautiful buildings, creating jobs, making deals. But sometimes, in all the winning, you can forget what you're really building for." The president stood up suddenly and walked to the window, looking out over the White House grounds. For a long moment, he was silent, his back to the room. When he turned around, those present were startled to see the glistening of tears in his eyes. "Your son," he said to Musk, though his gaze remained fixed on the boy. "He reminds me of what this is all supposed to be about." The vulnerability of the moment was striking. This was a man whose public image had been built on projecting strength and unwavering confidence, now visibly moved by a child's simple wish for a more just world. Musk nodded slowly, a look of quiet pride crossing his face as he regarded his son. "He has a way of cutting through to what matters," he said quietly. What followed was something remarkable, a conversation between one of the world's wealthiest innovators, the President of the United States, and a child whose moral compass hadn't yet been complicated by the realities of politics or profit margins. They talked not about space rockets or business ventures, but about hunger and homelessness, about education and opportunity. And as they spoke, the adults in the room found themselves reminded of something essential, that beneath the complexity of policy and the pragmatism of politics, there remained simple truths about human dignity and our responsibility to one another. As the meeting drew to a close, Trump knelt down to the boy's eye level, a gesture of rare humility from a man accustomed to towering over rooms. "I want you to know something," he said softly. "What you said today, it matters. Sometimes it takes a young person to remind us old folks what really counts." It was a moment that would stay with everyone present, a reminder that even in the corridors of ultimate power, the simplest wisdom often comes from the youngest hearts. And as Elon Musk and his son departed the Oval Office that day, they left behind a president who had been touched not by political strategy or business acumen, but by the uncomplicated moral clarity of a child. The video of what transpired that day in the Oval Office was never meant to be shared publicly. It had been recorded for internal archival purposes only, capturing what was supposed to be a straightforward meeting between a tech visionary and the president. But somehow, weeks later, a 2-minute clip found its way onto social media. Within hours, it had been viewed millions of times. The unguarded moment of the president, a man known for his tough exterior and unflinching confidence, visibly moved by a child's simple wish for a better world, struck a chord that transcended political divides. "I've never seen him like that," commented one longtime Trump supporter, sharing the video on her feed. "This is the man I voted for. Someone who, beneath it all, cares about the same things we all do." Even critics who had spent years opposing Trump's policies found themselves pausing before reflexively dismissing the moment. There was something undeniably authentic about the interaction that cut through the usual noise of partisan politics. "Politics aside, this is what humanity looks like," wrote one prominent Democratic commentator. "When we strip away the rhetoric and posturing, aren't these the values we all share?" The clip sparked something unusual in America's fractured landscape, a rare moment of contemplation that transcended the usual tribal lines. News programs ran special segments analyzing not just the political implications, but the human element of what the media had dubbed the Innocent Summit. In Silicon Valley, tech leaders watched with particular interest. Many had positioned their companies as vehicles for changing the world, but the innocent question from Musk's son, why focus on space when poverty persists on Earth, forced uncomfortable reflection. Were they truly building toward meaningful progress for humanity, or merely chasing the next innovation regardless of its social impact? At SpaceX headquarters, Elon Musk called an all-hands meeting. Employees filed into the expansive assembly area, where rocket components usually took center stage. Today, however, their CEO stood alone at the front, uncharacteristically solemn. "By now, I'm sure most of you have seen the video," Musk began. "What you witnessed was my son speaking from his heart, without filters or calculations. And it's made me think about something important." The usually frenetic entrepreneur paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I started this company, I talked about making humanity multi-planetary as an insurance policy for our species. And I still believe in that mission. But my son reminded me of something essential, that we can't leave Earth's problems behind. We need to solve them in parallel." What followed was the announcement of a new initiative, the Earth First Fund. Musk pledged to allocate a significant portion of his personal wealth and SpaceX resources toward addressing immediate human needs, sustainable food production, clean water access, and housing innovations that could be deployed in the world's most vulnerable regions. "My son wants to end world hunger when he grows up," Musk told his employees, a rare smile softening his features. "I told him we shouldn't wait that long." Back in Washington, the White House was dealing with the unexpected fallout from the viral video. Presidential aides debated how to respond. Some worried that the emotional moment might be perceived as weakness. Others saw a unique opportunity to reach across the aisle and reframe the administration's priorities. Inside the Oval Office, Trump sat alone, rewatching the clip on his phone. The sight of his own tears still surprised him. It had been years, decades perhaps, since he had allowed himself that kind of vulnerability, especially in a professional setting. He thought about his own children, his grandchildren. He thought about the legacy he wanted to leave behind when all the politics and posturing faded away. A real estate empire? His name on buildings? Or something more fundamental, a world where every child had the opportunity to thrive. Later that week, to the surprise of both his supporters and detractors, Trump invited a bipartisan group of lawmakers to the White House. The topic wasn't border security or tax policy or any of the usual partisan flashpoints. Instead, they discussed childhood poverty in America and what concrete steps could be taken to address it. "I had a wake-up call recently," the president told the assembled politicians. "Sometimes it takes a child to remind us why we're really here. We can fight about how to solve these problems, but we shouldn't be fighting about whether they're worth solving." Across the country, the conversation was changing. The viral moment had created a window of possibility, a brief opening where the most basic human values were being recentered in public discourse. In a school in rural Kentucky, teachers used the video as a starting point for discussions about citizenship and compassion. "What would you say to the president if you had the chance?" they asked their students, encouraging them to think about the world they wanted to inherit. In a homeless shelter in Los Angeles, volunteers reported a surge in donations and inquiries about how to help. "People keep referencing that video," said one coordinator. "It's like it gave everyone permission to care openly about these issues again." Of course, not everyone was moved. Cynics in media and politics dismissed the moment as staged or inconsequential. "Tears don't feed hungry children," wrote one columnist. "We need policy, not sentiment." But for many Americans, the human connection displayed in that Oval Office meeting represented something they had been missing in public life. A reminder that beneath the rhetoric and division, there remained a shared commitment to basic human dignity. For Musk's son, the aftermath of that day was both confusing and illuminating. Too young to fully comprehend his sudden symbolic importance in the national conversation, he nevertheless understood that his words had mattered in some significant way. "Dad, are people still going to be hungry?" he asked one evening as Musk tucked him into bed. The billionaire entrepreneur, a man accustomed to thinking in terms of technological solutions and market disruptions, found himself humbled by the directness of the question. "Some will be, yes," he answered honestly. "Big problems take time to solve. But here's what's different now. More people are working on it together, including us." The boy nodded, processing this answer with the particular seriousness that children sometimes bring to moral questions. "Good," he said finally, "because I meant what I said to the president." As his son drifted off to sleep, Musk remained by the bedside, contemplating the unexpected chain of events that had unfolded from that White House meeting. In the world of technology and business, disruption was a buzzword, the ability to completely transform existing systems through innovation. But perhaps the most profound disruption had come from the simplest source: a child's uncomplicating moral clarity cutting through the noise of adult compromises. The true impact of that day was still unfolding, rippling outward in ways nobody could fully predict. But something had shifted, not just in policy discussions or charitable initiatives, but in the underlying recognition of what truly mattered. And it had started with a child's wish for a world where nobody would go hungry. 3 months after the viral moment that touched millions, the relationship between Elon Musk and President Trump had evolved into something few political analysts could have predicted. Their collaboration transcended the usual boundaries between business and government, driven by a shared purpose that had been catalyzed by a child's simple wish. The White House Rose Garden was filled with journalists and dignitaries on a crisp spring morning as the president and the tech entrepreneur stood side by side at a podium adorned with both the presidential seal and the logos of Musk's companies. Behind them stood a diverse group of experts: agricultural scientists, logistics specialists, economists, and humanitarian workers, assembled for what had been billed as a major announcement. "When I was a businessman," Trump began, his voice carrying across the garden, "I measured success by what I built: the tallest buildings, the most beautiful properties, the biggest deals. But a few months ago, I was reminded of a different kind of measurement, one that's about what we build for others, not just for ourselves." He glanced briefly at Musk's son, who sat in the front row beside his siblings, looking both nervous and proud in a carefully pressed suit that seemed slightly too large for his frame. "Today we're announcing the American Hunger Initiative," Trump continued. "A public-private partnership unlike anything we've attempted before. Not a handout program, but a complete reimagining of how we produce and distribute food in this country, and eventually around the world." Musk stepped forward, his usual rapid-fire speaking style tempered for the occasion. "This initiative combines advanced agricultural technology with new distribution systems designed to eliminate food waste and ensure that no community in America lacks access to nutritious food. We're applying the same innovative approach we use for rocket science to something even more important: feeding people." The details of the plan unfolded over the next 30 minutes. Vertical farming technologies developed by SpaceX engineers that could produce massive crop yields in urban centers, a fleet of electric delivery vehicles from Tesla specifically designed for food distribution, automated systems that could identify and respond to community needs in real time, and a nationwide network of community food centers that would double as educational hubs. "We're allocating $15 billion in federal funding," Trump announced, "matched by $20 billion from our private sector partners, led by Mr. Musk. This isn't about politics. This is about making sure every American child goes to bed with a full stomach." What the public didn't see were the late-night conversations that had preceded this announcement. the unlikely friendship that had formed between the brash, outspoken president and the equally unconventional entrepreneur. Two men with enormous egos who had found in their own way something that transcended personal ambition. In the White House residence one evening, Trump had confided something he rarely shared. "You know, I grew up with plenty, never had to worry about my next meal. But my father always told me, don't forget where other people are coming from." I think sometimes I did forget. Musk, whose own journey from South Africa to becoming one of the world's wealthiest individuals had been anything but conventional, understood something about perspective. "My childhood wasn't always easy," he had replied, "but I never faced true hunger. My son asks questions I sometimes can't answer. Why, with all our technology and wealth, we haven't solved these basic problems." It was in these private moments, away from cameras and public scrutiny, that the initiative had taken shape, not just as a policy program or a corporate responsibility project, but as something more personal to both men. As the Rose Garden announcement concluded, attention turned to Musk's son. A reporter called out, "Young man, how does it feel to have started all this with your question to the president?" Before any adult could intervene, the boy stepped forward with unexpected confidence. "I just said what I was thinking," he answered simply. "I didn't know it would make the president cry, or that my dad would build all this stuff. I just thought it wasn't fair that some kids don't have enough food." The authenticity of his response triggered gentle laughter across the audience, but also nods of appreciation. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. That evening, as media outlets dissected the announcement from every angle, praising its ambition, questioning its implementation, debating its political implications, the real story was unfolding away from public view. In the Musk household, a family dinner became an impromptu strategy session. The children peppered their father with questions about how the new technologies would work, offering their own surprisingly insightful suggestions about reaching kids their age. The son whose question had started it all sat quietly for much of the meal, listening intently. "What are you thinking about?" Musk eventually asked him. The boy considered the question carefully before responding. "I'm thinking that it's good we're helping people in America. But what about kids in other countries? Are they going to get help too?" Musk exchanged a glance with his partner across the table, a look that acknowledged the boundless moral horizon of their child's perspective. There was no stopping point, no mission accomplished, as long as suffering continued anywhere. "That's phase 2, Musk explained. "We start here, perfect the systems, and then we expand. President Trump and I already talked about it. Once we prove this works in America, we'll take it global." The boy nodded, satisfied for now, but clearly already thinking ahead to the next question, the next challenge. Meanwhile, at the White House, President Trump sat in the Oval Office reviewing polling data that showed something remarkable. Approval for the Hunger Initiative crossed party lines in a way few presidential actions ever achieved. In a deeply divided America, they had found something that resonated with a fundamental shared value. "Sir," said his chief of staff, "this could be a defining achievement of your presidency." Trump set the polling report aside and walked to the window, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. "You know what's funny? I've put my name on towers and golf courses and all sorts of things, but this, something I can't put my name on, might be the thing I'm most proud of." He thought about the boy whose words had pierced through decades of political calluses. Children had a way of asking the questions adults had learned to avoid, the simple, unanswerable questions that cut to the heart of our shared humanity. The real transformation, though, wasn't happening in the corridors of power or corporate boardrooms. It was unfolding in communities across America as the first pilot programs of the initiative began operations. In a formerly abandoned warehouse in Detroit, now converted to a vertical farm that employed local residents and provided fresh produce to neighborhoods that had been food deserts for generations. In a small town in Appalachia, where a community food center had become the heart of local life, offering not just meals but cooking classes, nutritional education, and a gathering place. And in schools nationwide, where a new conversation was taking place, one that centered not on charity or handouts, but on innovation and human dignity. Children were learning that the technology that could send rockets to Mars could also be harnessed to address humanity's most basic needs. It wasn't a perfect solution. Critics rightly pointed out the challenges of implementation, the bureaucratic hurdles, the entrenched systems that resisted change. But something fundamental had shifted in the national conversation. A recognition that the measure of a society's advancement wasn't just in its technological achievements, but in how it ensured the well-being of its most vulnerable members. And it had all begun with a child's question and a president's tears. 1 year to the day after that fateful meeting in the Oval Office, a special gathering took place at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Under a vast white tent that stretched across the iconic American space, tables had been set for what the media was calling America's Family Dinner, a symbolic meal bringing together people from all walks of life. At the center table sat President Trump, Elon Musk and his family, alongside families who had been among the first beneficiaries of the American Hunger Initiative. What had begun as an emotional moment between a powerful man and a thoughtful child had blossomed into a movement that was reshaping the nation's approach to one of its most persistent problems. "When I look back on this past year," Trump said, addressing the assembled guests and the cameras broadcasting the event nationwide, "I'm reminded that the greatest changes often come from the most unexpected sources." His gaze settled on Musk's son, who was no longer just the anonymous child from the viral video. He had become, in many ways, the face of a new kind of social conscience, a reminder that sometimes the clearest moral vision comes from those who haven't yet learned to accept the world's imperfections as inevitable. 1 year ago, this young man asked me a question that no cabinet meeting, no policy advisor, no political strategist had ever posed quite so directly. He asked me why, with all our resources, we still allow people in our country to go hungry. And he told me about his dream to end world hunger. Trump paused, the weight of the memory visible in his expression. "I've been called many things in my life, but easily moved to tears was never one of them." He continued with a self-deprecating smile that earned gentle laughter from the crowd. Yet something about the pure intention behind those words broke through defenses I didn't even know I still had. The cameras panned across the tent, capturing the diverse faces of those gathered, from corporate executives who had contributed billions to the initiative, to community organizers who had transformed its resources into real-world impact, to families whose lives had been directly improved by its programs. Today, I'm proud to announce that in just 1 year, childhood hunger in America has decreased by 27%, Trump declared, his voice rising with genuine pride. That's 2.3 million children who no longer wonder where their next meal is coming from. The applause that followed wasn't the perfunctory response of a political gathering, but something more heartfelt, a collective recognition of progress on something that transcended the usual divisions. As the dinner proceeded, cameras captured quiet moments that told the deeper story. Musk deepened conversation with a farmer from Nebraska, whose community had been revitalized by one of the initiative's agricultural technology centers. Trump listening intently to a single mother from Philadelphia, describing how the program had allowed her to return to school while ensuring her children had nutritious meals. And throughout it all, Musk's son, taking it all in with the particular seriousness that had become his hallmark. When the formal program concluded, the boy approached the podium, whispered something to the president, who nodded with an encouraging smile. An aide quickly adjusted the microphone to accommodate his height. "Hello," the boy began, his voice small but steady in the large space. "I didn't know my question would make such a big difference. I just said what I was thinking." He paused, gathering his thoughts with a maturity beyond his years. "My dad always tells me that when you see a problem, you should try to fix it instead of just talking about it." I'm still a kid, so I can't fix big problems by myself. But what I learned this year is that when people work together, even people who don't always agree about other things, we can solve problems that seem really big." Across the tent, hardened political operatives and cynical journalists found themselves unexpectedly moved by the child's unvarnished sincerity. "I still want to end world hunger when I grow up," he continued, "but I don't want to wait until then to help. I think that's what all of us can do, not wait for someone else to fix things." As he stepped away from the microphone, the tent erupted in a standing ovation. It wasn't just applause for an adorable child speaking publicly. It was recognition of a fundamental truth he had articulated, that the responsibility for creating a more just world belonged to everyone, not to some distant future or someone else's authority. Later that evening, as the formal event wound down, Trump and Musk found themselves momentarily alone in a quiet corner of the tent. Two men whose outsized personalities and achievements had defined their public images, now bonded by something neither had anticipated. "Your son," Trump said quietly, "he's going to change the world even more than you have, Elon. And that's saying something." Musk nodded, a father's pride evident in his expression. "He already has. He made Elon Musk and Donald Trump work together on feeding people instead of building rockets or borders. If that's not changing the world, I don't know what is." Both men laughed, acknowledging the unlikely nature of their partnership. "You know," Trump added, his tone growing reflective, "throughout my career, I wanted to be remembered for the biggest deals, the tallest buildings, winning the presidency. But when I'm gone, this might be what matters most, that we moved the needle on something real." As they rejoined the main gathering, the president was approached by a journalist who had been covering his career for decades. "Mr. President," she asked, "a year ago, we saw you moved to tears by a child's question. Looking back, how do you view that moment now?" Trump considered the question carefully, his usual rapid-fire response style giving way to something more measured. "I've spent a lifetime projecting strength," he answered. "Never show weakness, never let them see you sweat. That was my motto in business and in politics. But that day, I learned something important about what real strength looks like. Sometimes it looks like admitting that a child can see something clearly that the rest of us have complicated into oblivion." The journalist pressed further. "And the tears. Do you regret showing that vulnerability?" Trump's gaze drifted across the tent to where Musk's son was helping younger children with their desserts, ensuring everyone got an equal portion. "Not for a second," he replied. "Those tears were a reminder of our shared humanity. In a world that often tries to divide us into opposing teams, that boy reminded all of us, that some values transcend our differences." As the evening came to a close, attendees departed with commemorative coins bearing a simple inscription. "It begins with recognizing hunger. It ends when we act together." On the reverse was an image of a child's hand reaching upward, symbolizing both vulnerability and hope. The American Hunger Initiative had become more than a policy program or a charitable enterprise. It had evolved into a movement that was changing not just access to food, but the national conversation about collective responsibility. International leaders had taken notice, with delegations from dozens of countries visiting the program's operational centers to learn how to implement similar approaches in their own nations. The model was being adapted for different contexts, cultures, and economies, each implementation learning from and improving upon the others. And at the heart of it all remained the pure, uncompromising moral vision of a child who had asked why, in a world of plenty, anyone should go hungry. As Musk's family prepared to leave the event, his son tugged gently at his sleeve. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you think we'll really end hunger everywhere someday?" Musk knelt down to his son's level, the gesture reminiscent of how Trump had addressed the boy a year earlier. "I don't just think it," he replied. "I know it. And when we do, people will remember it started with you asking a question that made a president cry. The boy smiled, satisfied not by the recognition, but by the promise of a better world still taking shape. A world where the simplest moral truths were finally being given the attention they deserved. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that matter. Turn on notifications so you never miss our new uploads. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Sometimes the simplest questions from the purest hearts can change the world. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when a child's perspective changed how you saw the world. Your story could inspire thousands. This isn't just a story, it's a reminder that when we listen to our children and act on their wisdom, we can solve problems that seem impossible.